My name is Christopher Baus. I'm the Senior Engineering Manager for Component Testing. First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming today. It's been something that's been on our radar for quite a long time now, and I'm really glad that we had the turnout that we've had, and I just want to thank other people that helped out to bring this together, Ronald and Jess as well, to bring people together to talk about component testing. Is something we focus a lot on at Cypress in the last 18 months since I started, which kind of brings me to a little bit about myself. I've been at Cypress now for about 18 months. Time flies, it's hard to believe. My initial focus at Cypress was really on the Cypress 10 release, making sure that we were able to bring component testing to a beta phase and get it out to all of you users. That was our focus for basically my first 6 months. And since then, we've really been focused on bringing component testing to the mainstream, making sure that it's reliable and ready for general availability, which we released last year with the Cypress 11 release. And we continue to discuss Cypress 11 with all of you, our Cypress component testing with all of you, and kind of just bring it to the masses. And that's really our goal, is to bring component testing to a larger audience in the next year. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I'm talking a little bit today about component testing a little bit from a different perspective. Typically in conferences, especially tech conferences, managers don't have a lot of representation. It's really from the engineering perspective. But if you think about the way engineering teams work, really you have to have buy-in from both the management and also engineers. So it's really a kind of a melding of the two, and you have to work together to basically get to the results that you want. So even though many of you might not be managers on this call today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how managers think about tool selection and how we think about just how running our teams and kind of the pressures that we have as a manager that might be a little bit different than engineers have on their day-to-day work. A little bit about myself too, is I worked at a couple different startups prior to coming to Cypress. I actually worked as an engineer as a startup a few years ago, so I have pretty deep understanding of sort of the pitfalls of working with components and component testing, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end of the presentation. Yeah, so like I said, this will give you a little more insight into how managers think. That's my goal here, not necessarily to discuss this from a management point of view, but if you're working with a manager, maybe you want to bring a new tool to the table. Maybe it's Cypress component testing, maybe it's something else. And thinking about it the way the manager thinks about it could be helpful to basically get to the goal that you want, to basically get more efficiency, to basically make your life easier as a developer. You have to basically sort of sometimes convince your manager that something is worthwhile to invest in. And this may give you some ideas about why managers think the way they do and the decisions that we make into sort of just tool selection, including component testing. So this is kind of a cliche slide. I know a lot of people have seen this. There's some variants on this. Is basically the trade-offs that we make as engineers, or maybe in product development in general, is that basically there's three different areas that you can focus on: good, cheap, and fast. Kind of pick two of these things, right? If you're good and cheap, it's not developed fast. If it's fast and good, then it's not cheap, right? Well, here's the reality of the situation. And basically, in today's world, we're basically forced as managers to address all of these issues. So, if I'm talking to my management, which is basically senior management, they're going to not push on just one or two of these things. They're going to expect all three of these things. So basically, what is the expectation of the senior management? All three. So while engineering generally is the kind of the idea of trading off different things, and I talk about to my engineers all the time, like, hey, if we trade X for this, then we're going to have to make some other trade-off. Eventually, we have to push forward all three of these fronts simultaneously, and I'll just go find one or two of these things. We got to push all of these things forward. We basically tools, maybe my internet connections get unstable. If you look at the sort of the effectiveness of tools that we had maybe like 20 years ago versus the effectiveness of tools right now, we do a lot more with a lot less, and that's because of the work that's done before us in this area. So as time basically goes on, we're able to move forward in all three of these fronts. So when I hear from my manager, we need to accelerate the release of X product, well, that might cost us I'm going to come at the cost of some other feature, but he's not looking to basically limit the sort of the quality or the cost. To basically, we're not going to hire more engineers. He's looking to basically accelerate in all three fronts of these things. And maybe that comes at a trade-off of another feature, but we're not going to make a trade-off that basically it comes at the cost of quality. So the reality is we have to look at all three of these things. So where does component testing come into this, and where would you talk to your sort of management about this? Well, component testing, from my perspective, really attacks two of these areas. One is the efficiency. How can we develop applications more quickly? And two is how can we do it with higher quality code? And by attacking these two, ultimately, if we're more effective, the cost of engineering really is in labor, is really in all of you, all development costs. That's really where the cost of engineering is. It isn't in the tooling. It's in the, if you look at any budget for any engineering team, it always comes down to the labor. So anything we can do that makes things engineers more effective or more efficient is how we're going to judge the value of a tool. That's where our budgets come into play, and that's how we can basically accelerate initiatives is through engineering effectiveness. And so that's where component testing really comes into play, is it trying to make sure that all engineers are more effective and using their time more effectively. You know, if you're talking to your manager maybe is not developed in a few years and maybe is worked in other areas. Maybe you focus on, you know, project management, for instance, which I focus a lot of my time on these days. They might be coming from a different perspective, a different time. You know, there were other tools that we did a lot of server-side development, and we thought about these basically from a page level development. It's like PHP or Ruby on Rails. We didn't really think from a component perspective. So the one thing you really need to talk to your management about is really like thinking in terms of like breaking down the application in individual components. I know that seems sort of obvious. We're talking about component testing today, but that's kind of the first step. If we're not talking about component-driven development, we might as well not have the discussion about component testing. First, we have to think about our application as a group of components, just as like this screen says. I think I took this from the Next.js, so thanks to the Next.js guys for developing this, but basically it just shows a layout of a page. Instead of thinking about in terms of a page, we're thinking about the logo, the address, the form, the nav, buttons. We think about this as a group of components, and then we can test and develop these components in isolation, which basically allows us to bring component testing into play and basically make our teams more effective. Yeah, so I mean, generally, we just have to think about like what is, you know, basically how do we develop tools in isolation? How do we basically parallelize our development? That's one thing we think a lot too, is that engineering managers. How do we parallelize development? Well, components allow us to parallelize development. One engineer can work on one component, another engineer can another component. Then we can integrate the components together, sort of at the sort of a later phase in the development. But you know, basically, it's just a way to accelerate the application development process. And like I mentioned, and this is something that I think Lachlan talked about, is we basically allows us to develop our tests in isolation. So instead of testing the entire application as we do in end-to-end, which is really where we started at Cypress, it allows us to test smaller portions of our project in isolation. So you're looking at just maybe looking at a button, for instance. How does that button, if maybe it changes color when you press it, maybe it activate something else to happen. Is that functioning correctly? If you look at that in isolation and test it and make sure it's working correctly, then you have more confidence when you go to bring your entire application together that the entire application works as it should. So one thing component testing allows you to do, if you've broken your application into separate components, is test in isolation. Shift left, and this has come up a couple times in questions already, is something we talk a lot about in this industry, is like where do we start the testing process, right? Do we, in a lot of times in end-to-end testing, there's separate teams that basically do, and this is one companies I've worked on in the past, that develop these end-to-end tests completely separate of engineering. You'll basically hand off the application to another team, and they'll come in and basically write the end-to-end test to verify that the application does what it should do. The component testing, it's a lot easier for developers to get involved in the testing sooner in the process, right? So this is a lot more sort of effective to make sure like we're not waiting to the last minute to start our testing process. We can start our testing process sooner by looking at smaller increments of the application to start the testing to make sure that the smaller components are working correctly before we go to integrate them into a larger portion of the application. We don't want to go all the way to the end of the process, the development of the application, to find out that something's failing that was a result of basically a component that was written wrong, you know, 3 months ago or something. We want to find out that something's written wrong right away during the sort of development of the application versus at the very end. So component testing allows and increases the sort of the ability for teams to sort of shift left and allow developers to work on the testing process sooner in the process. And this shouldn't be underestimated, quite frankly, standardizing tools, right? It's again, as far as team efficiency, if you're already using Cypress for end-to-end testing, it makes a lot of sense. And this is one of the reasons I came to Cypress. I saw that we were using Jest and Vue test utils at one of the companies I worked at, and we're using Cypress simultaneously. I can remember when we brought Cypress in, it was like a breath of fresh air. Like, wow, this is so much easier than the tools that we're using right now. I love to continue using Cypress, but we're using Cypress in conjunction with another tools. So that's like a lot of mental overhead as a developer. You have to do these constant context switching between basically one tool to another. If you're onboarding engineers, you have to think like, well, I have to teach them how to use this tool, then I have to teach them how to use this other tool and how they work together and how they're different, how they're similar. That's just a lot of time. That's time that could be invested in your application versus into thinking about your actual tool stack. So what Cypress component testing allows you to do is standardize in one tool stack. End-to-end testing, you basically use the same API that component testing does, with some minor differences, basically the mount versus the visit. That's the fundamental difference. But as far as the fundamental testing of the application, the actual API is the same. So this is huge. Like if you're going to, one thing you're going to basically discuss with your manager, standardizing your tools, standardizing your basically, and avoiding that context switching. That's one thing managers are always looking to avoid, is just that context switching with their engineers. So the last thing I want to talk about today is really like testing the behavior of the application. Now, this is a little story I want to talk here. So years ago, I was working at another startup, and I was working as an engineer, quite frankly, and we were working on the early days, working on, I think, Vue 2 application, right? And so we had developed this massive application, and we had developed hundreds, maybe even thousands of unit tests, as we call them back then, but really they were component tests written in Vue test utils, an early version of it using Jest. And one thing we did, and one of the mistakes we made, and this can be fixed or not, in modern versions of sort of the Vue test utils, but we made a mistake early on, and this was actually documented, was we tested the behavior of the application, right? Or sorry, we tested the implementation and not the behavior of the application. By testing the implementations, we basically cause ourselves to re-implement hundreds of unit tests when we change the application itself. And this cost us enormous amount of time in engineering. It could have cost us weeks of time, quite frankly, when in a startup is enormous, quite frankly, rewriting hundreds of unit tests because we were testing the implementation and not the behavior. And in Cypress, and this is like, I remember talking to Mark about this when I decided to join Cypress. He convinced me that this was the way to go forward. In Cypress, and other tools do this now too, but it was really the focus of Cypress, like test the way the user thinks about the application, test through the browser. Don't test in using some other sort of DOM implementation. Use the DOM that the user is actually using and test the way the user thinks about it. So this is was kind of a epiphany for me as we were making sort of these early mistakes in sort of testing our components by testing the implementation, not behavior. And this was costing us a lot of time. And I realized that Cypress component testing, with the way we're thinking about it, just was a more effective tool. So, and this is going to scare some engineers, like they don't realize that I can still maybe write code at times, but I can. So here we go. This is the Vue counter button. Like if you ever look at the Vue example, this is the example they give, right? It's like, how do you create a counter? Click a button and basically count and write to the count in the button itself in Vue. So it's a very simple component written in Vue 3 that basically stores the count in a ref. And you see here at this point, here is basically every time you click the button, the count goes up and it stores the count in the ref. So it's a very, very simple component. So this is how we do it in Cypress component testing. Basically, we mount the counter. So we mount the component. This is the difference between maybe the Cypress component testing and Cypress end-to-end testing. Instead of visiting, we do the mount here. And then we basically get the button, click the button, and then said, should it contain the count as 1? And this is happening exactly all through the browser, just the way the user thinks about this, right? We basically get the button, click the button, and then see what it contains. So, well, the count is 1. All right, perfect. This test passed because it does what we expect. It starts at 0, get it 1 click. So no problems here. What we used to do, and this is in sort of earlier version of test utils, is basically do something like look at the actual implementation down here, like the VM.count. So we're actually looking at the ref and then seeing, is that expected to be 1? this is fine and this test will pass until you change the name of one of your component or one of your variables like count. That has nothing to do with the implementation of it. It has, or the behavior of it. It's only an implementation detail, right? So other tools really early on really were focused on testing the implementation, not really on the behavior, where Cypress component testing is really focused on the behavior. With that said, you look at the modern versions of Vue test utils, you can do it in is the same kind of testing using Vue test utils. Oops, what happened here? It's just a little bit different syntax. But the point is that Cypress basically leads you, like I say, leads the horse to water and kind of gives you the right approach to testing, which is to test the behavior, not the implementation. So to wrap this up, component testing really isn't a silver bullet. It's not going to allow engineering teams to advance quickly in all three fronts, but allow you to take an incremental step forward in sort of the efficiency of your teams, right? That's what you're looking for as a manager. How can I take these incremental steps forward to sort of over time address all three of the things we talked about at the beginning of the talk? How can we move our teams forward to be more effective, more efficient, high quality? And component testing is one of those tools in the toolbox that basically allows that. So yeah, so if you had one takeaway, is that engineering managers are concerned about the efficiencies of their team. So if you're going to talk to your manager about any tool, whether it's Cypress component testing or anything else, talk to them about not so much about the API or how you enjoy using it or the DX. Those things are important, but that's not how your manager thinks about it. They think about it in terms of how is this going to make my team more effective? How am I going to be able to deliver more value in a shorter amount of time? How are we going to be able to do more with less? So anytime you're trying to propose a new sort of tool selection to your manager, always think about it in those sort of terms. Think about how you can make your team more effective and more efficient. And that's the one way to think about component testing. If you're trying to bring a component testing into your organization, argue on these points of efficiency, and I think you'll have more success in that area. So yeah, that's all I have to say. And thanks a lot. I really appreciate everyone for coming today. And if there's any questions, we can take them now.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. That was awesome. You covered a lot of the things that I think were going to be questions from the chat and that I kind of had on deck as well, especially in talking about your experience with component testing before using Cypress. I did want to ask about like your approach to choosing a tool or your mindset, because you have been both an engineer and a manager. What's your different mindset that you recall from being an engineer thinking about what tool to use compared to being a manager about thinking the impact of a tool would have on your team or something like that? Do you have different memories of what you prioritize as an engineer compared to a manager?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an engineer, you're much more close to the iron, right? So you're feeling a lot more, I'd say, emotional almost about the tool, right? Because you're using it every day, right? So like your decision of whether or not you're going to use, say, Cypress versus Vue test utils, for instance, like it's almost like an emotional decision. Like we had written so many tests in Vue test utils, and we were very involved with that. We can see the cost of using that tool and how it was affecting our teams on a day-to-day basis. I can remember just bringing in Cypress, end-to-end testing and seeing the API and how much it simplified not just the lives of developers, but also the lives of other sort of testing teams. I saw this has got to be the way forward, right? So this is a much simpler thing. So I'm thinking as an engineer at a much more sort of raw level. As an engineering manager, we're looking at just like CI tools, for instance, recently. Like it's much more of a analytical discussion. Like, okay, we've got to move the needle X in this amount of time. Is this going to move the needle X in this amount of time? If it's not going to move the needle next time, we might have to deprioritize it, right? So I think as an engineering manager, you're looking at these decisions as a much more analytical point of view versus sort of an emotional point of view. So if you're going to make sort of a argument to your manager, I wouldn't argue so much on the emotional feeling on the DX, for instance. I would say, how is this going to save our team time and how are we going to get to our goals more quickly?
Cool. I have one other question based on your kind of what you talked about with your experience at Pendo, having lots of kind of front-end unit test or jest-based tests. What can you describe more about the context of like what kind of product is Pendo for people who might not be familiar with it? Is it very front-endy? What kind of scenarios did you have to test?
Yeah, I wasn't going to mention names here, but yeah, since
sorry,
might be from Pendo here, so like. Hi, nice to see you. Glad your customer still, so glad to see you on this call. But yeah, we worked on basically this huge application called the Designer. And what it was, it allowed you to design sort of components inside of the web browser. It was a huge, complicated application. It was something actually I'm very proud of to have worked on, quite frankly. It basically allowed you to like messaging and sort of like any kind of like in-app sort of display that you might send to the customer, like polling, for instance, NPS scores, allow you to design it all in the application and trigger it based on events that happen in your application. So it was a huge, very large, very early Vue 2 application that we invested a lot of time with Vue test utils. The irony is all this is like, I remember thinking, like, man, this Vue test utils is, this is interesting. Like we're doing all this work on this, but man, it's got this complication, it's got these issues. And I was thinking about it. Then it like sort of like it's kind of like cursing the designer of it. Turns out it's Lachlan. Lachlan we work with now, right? So it's being a lesson in life is like you don't know how things are going to pan out. So when we were working with Vue 2 and Vue early versions, and the Vue test utils has come a long way. So like I say, the early versions of Vue test utils, it was kind of funny because I was thinking, man, what is going on with this? But it really turns out it was developed by Lachlan, who is now an engineer on this team, which spoke earlier today. So you just never know how twists or turns your career is going to take, right? So
yeah, totally. And I would say as well that Vue test utils all by itself inherits some of the problems of just not being in a real browser. So all of the things you have to do to like manipulate the way that the world around a JavaScript function pretends to be a browser, like all of those pain points are just inherent.
I guess I would say it's
yeah.
like there's nothing inherently wrong with Vue testing. It was just the early days. Like we were very early days trying to do component development, early versions of Vue. We just, as an industry, we had matured a lot, right? I think even if you look at this last example of how we use Vue test utils now, that's a mature way of using it. So there's nothing particularly wrong with the tool itself, and that's not my point of view here. It's just that we've learned a lot in the last few years and how to develop components and how to test them.
Yeah, totally. And then we'll hand off to the next presentation in a second. But what you've done is reminded me of like the underlying implementation of each Cypress mount adapter that's built in is different. So even within Cypress, the Vue test utils is the code that allows us to mount components for Vue, and it's different custom stuff for React, it's different custom stuff for Angular. But the like escape hatch of being able to use Vue test utils through Cypress is there. For example, if you're migrating and you needed to, even though we almost never need to use it. I cannot think of the last time I've actually exposed like a Vue test utils thing in Cypress. All right, so next up is Murat.